Why would you bus if the current moral premise, if the current policy idea is correct, meaning that in order for a black student to achieve, in order to close that achievement gap, in order for black students to be fully served, they must have black teachers. If that's true, then why the hell did Kamala Harris need to be bused to a white school? Can somebody answer that question without sounding like a complete and utter idiot?
I wanted to dive into a really hot topic here in my neck of the woods. A lot of people in my district, their children attend Mankato Public Schools, and Mankato Public Schools voted a couple of weeks ago to pay black teachers a bonus for teaching other black teachers. And this is, they said it was a requirement of the state. And it's true. The state of Minnesota requires that they have this mentoring program. And they updated the language this year to address specifically people of color and indigenous people in Minnesota. But they are opting to pay them an additional bonus for mentoring other black teachers. The state of Minnesota also authorized a program to pay black teachers from out of state to come to Minnesota. And there was a lot of different, we've talked about this in the show before, where there's a lot of things, a lot of legislation that passed with racial undertones, right? This, which I call racist legislation. When you reward people with, financial benefits based on the color of their skin, not the content of their character or their merits, it's racist legislation. It's racist law. And Mankato was probably one of the first schools to formally implement this, and it brought a lot of bad optics to the region and a lot of bad press. So this story was picked up nationally, and because I came out, in opposition to this when it came to the legislature, and then also when Mankato Schools was debating this, doing some media and some radio shows, and was mentioned in Breitbart and Newsmax, and even some papers as far away as Tampa, Florida, on how bad this legislation is for the region. And I need to explain that it's not just about, paying black teachers more. We understand we have this major racial achievement gap in Minnesota where black students are performing far less than white students. That is a fact. It's one of the worst racial achievement gaps in the entire country. Now, I don't know if it's that the black students are performing worse than white students or worse than the average, or if white students are performing way above the average, where that gap has widened. But I understand we're trying to do something to address it. The Democrats in St. Paul are all about dividing students among race and then hiring teachers that look like them. We hear this all the time from people testifying. I want a teacher that looks like me, that understands my culture, that understands my language. And so the desire for Democrats is to get black teachers. Well, if we get black teachers, then what are we going to do with the black students? Are we going to put them all in the room with black teachers? And haven't we already done this before? And haven't we learned from our mistakes of the past? That was the same thing that happened in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, was to segregate people by race, because that is how you would teach black children, is have black teachers teach them. When I'm looking at what's happening in Mankato, I see this as pure segregation. And that is the ultimate goal of what this legislation is pushing us towards. And why am I the only one screaming down here about how bad this is? How do you see this?
Yeah, well, it's obviously segregation, and I agree with you that it is obviously racist. I mean, it's explicitly racist. As you say, the entire point of the 14th Amendment is to prevent precisely this: unequal treatment under the law on the basis of race. And that was the whole point of the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act. This is an explicit violation of that by the very same people who claim to champion that act and champion the movement that led to that act. And it's hypocritical, but it goes beyond that. Like, the insidious nature of this really needs to be examined in detail, because it's more than just segregation. It's more than just racism. Why did they want to do this? What is the premise the moral premise that they use to justify this type of policy. We've talked about it before when we've talked about critical race theory and what lies at the root of that theory, what that theory has to say about epistemology, about our means of knowledge, how we know what we know. The epistemological claim of critical race theory is ethnic Gnosticism. It's the idea that being black makes you privy to knowledge which non blacks do not have, and more importantly, cannot have. It's the idea that the amount of melanin in your skin determines what you know. That is the idea. It's absurd when you put it in those terms, but that is the idea, quite literally. They say that being black means that you know things that non blacks can't know. And so if you believe that, then of course you want to have black teachers teaching black students. How else are the black students going to know the things that are exclusive to black people and black culture? A black student could never possibly learn what they need to know from a non-black teacher because the non-black teacher is physically incapable by virtue of their skin color of knowing black things. This is where we're at. We're at a point of racism that transcends, that levels up what we saw in the 30s, 40s, 50s. The KKK was never preaching this garbage. Their idea was that non-whites, blacks, Asians, Hispanics were fundamentally inferior and physically and mentally incapable of achieving the same heights as the white man. That was the old school racism of the KKK and the old deep south. What we've managed to conjure in the 21st century is like the next level, the evolutionary step beyond that. It's the idea that being a certain color inherently, it's not even that you're capable of more or that you're capable of this or you're capable of that. It's that by being a certain color, you have inherent access to knowledge that other races simply do not and cannot have. That it is a new racism, a more insidious and prolific racism that is baked into the cake of critical race theory, which has been baked into the cake of education policy and economic policy and politics on the left and in the state of Minnesota.
Well, I see that. Uh, Listening to the Democrats present their bills to uh, segregate schools or to incentivize the hiring of more black teachers, I think that they're rooted in meaningful policy. Like they truly believe that this will close the achievement gap. But I just think that the ignorance of Democrats to completely ignore history of we've been down this road before. I think there were similar arguments made on why they should be hiring black teachers to teach black kids. They just need to go back and look at history and see we've already been here. It doesn't work. We need to treat everyone equally and in desegregate schools and teach to the top, teach all kids, but you shouldn't be just teaching to the bottom or separating kids based on race. It just doesn't make any sense. I mean, I don't even know how to. It's actually it should be this clear. Like, what am I missing here?
We need only go back a year and a half to the Democratic presidential primary, where now Vice President Kamala Harris, who was then a opponent of future President Joe Biden, was going after him on the basis of segregation and more specifically busing. You remember that whole episode where she made a big theatrical deal out of the idea that she was the little girl who was
Yes.
affected by busing, right? Now, why bus kids? Why bus black kids to white schools? Because that's what we were talking about back in the day, right? That's what she was making reference to. Why would you bus if the current moral premise, if the current policy idea is correct, meaning that in order for a black student to achieve, in order to close that achievement gap, in order for black students to be fully served, they must have black teachers. If that's true, then why the hell did Kamala Harris need to be bused to a white school? Can somebody answer that question without sounding like a complete and utter idiot? I would love to hear somebody attempt to answer that question in good faith. They can't, because it's obviously absurd. But this is what happens when you don't have a logical, rational basis for your policies. When the point of your policies and the morality that you're bringing to bear to try to discern what policies ought to be, it doesn't start and end with reason and facts and objectivity, and you're only concerned with politics, you're only concerned with pitting one group against another, you're only concerned with the capacity to achieve and consolidate power in order to affect your agenda, then you don't have to worry about little things like consistency between what you were calling for a year and a half ago and what you're calling for today.
Yeah. If all the companies in Minnesota, private employers, public employers, are required to be equal opportunity employers. We have employment laws that are very strict on preventing employers from making decisions based on race. And if a Mankato public school chose to hire a white teacher instead of a black teacher, specifically because they were white, there is not a court of law in our area who would not come down like a hammer on that
That's
school
right.
for being racist, right?
Mm-hmm.
We live in rural Minnesota, but there's no tolerance for racism in rural Minnesota. In our courts, it is just, it's not palatable here. So we don't have to, worry about employers making these decisions, and if we catch them, not prosecuting them. But it's gone the opposite way now. And I don't want to use the term reverse racism, but it is. But this policy is just racist. Period.
Yeah.
And it should also not be tolerated. I think it's just very few people are willing to talk about it. I got a call from the radio show host here in Mankato, and he's like, "Hey, would you come on and talk about this? Would you be willing to do that?" I'm like, "Sure, I'll talk about it." And I'm not on the education committee, but I know the arguments. I heard the bill, and he said that there was a Mankato school board member who resigned right after this passed, and they were going to come on, and then they chose not to come on the show, and I'm sure they don't want to talk about it.
Well, and let me speak to that, because that's an important point. And it's a point that I have made on this show in the past, but it bears repeating. Wake up, Whitey. Okay? You cannot, it can't just be me. You cannot just be waiting and looking over at your black friend or your black neighbor and saying, would you mind saying something about this? Like, you have to stand up for yourself with clear, confident, moral certitude and condemn this overt, obvious racism. As you say, there's no such thing as reverse racism. The notion of reverse racism actually affirms the idea that racism only flows in one direction, typically, which is what the left proclaims and buys right into the whole premise of critical race theory. No, racism is racism. If you believe that race is determinative of ability, potential, capacity, intelligence, right? If you believe that people ought to be assigned social status on the basis of their race, then you are racist. Whether you're a member of the KKK, whether you're white and you feel that way against black people, or whether you're a college professor or a politician or the vice president of the United States and you're black and you feel that way against white people. Either way, it is equally atrocious, equally evil, and must be equally condemned. And the only way this stuff is ever going to change is if those of us who know that, regardless of the color of our skin, are out there vehemently and passionately and without let up, calling it out, condemning it, and demanding that it be reversed.
Absolutely. Um, Well, Walter, I mean, what are I, I think we're in agreement on this policies being horrible. What are the solutions or proposals from our side on how to narrow this achievement gap, this racial achievement gap? Or is it even something we should be dividing people in race in order to determine it? I mean, I thought if we run the same statistics based on socioeconomic status, if their parents are single or married, we might come up with the same achievement gap
Right.
based
Right.
on other things other than race. But if it is just race and not socioeconomic status or whether their parents are married or not, what are some things we could do to narrow that gap?
Well, I think you hit on it, right? Is that we have to reject the entire premise. The premise of the achievement gap is rooted in a form of racism. It's the idea that, look, this notion that has been enshrined in American jurisprudence over the past couple of decades, that racism equals disparate outcomes, that racism is statistical. It's determined by how white students are doing versus how black students are doing. It's determined by the average wage of black men versus the average wage of white men, or whatever the statistic is that people are pointing to try to indicate, oh, there's obviously racism here because of these statistical disparities. That's it's difficult for me to contain and therefore channel my criticism of this, right? Um, it's insultingly simplistic. It's an idea that depends upon the stupidity of the supposed beneficiary to accept it. People are not doing poor in school because they're black. Anybody want to disagree? Anybody want to step up and disagree with that statement? You're seriously going to try to put forward the notion that the reason somebody's doing poorly is because they're black? Okay, so now that we're all in agreement, or at least we won't pipe up and say that we disagree with that premise. If being black doesn't cause the statistical disparity, then it must therefore be something else. Yet every single time we try to draw attention to whatever the something else might be, you talk about socioeconomic status, you talk about family status, you talk about marriage, you talk about the integrity of the community, you talk about crime in the community, law enforcement, all these different broader aspects of society that we can look at. Anytime you try to draw attention to any of those environmental impacts that have an effect on whether or not a sixth grader is going to be able to complete his assignment and do so competently, what are you told? Oh, you're being a racist. You're you're refusing to address race. You're ignoring race by wanting to talk about all these other things that have nothing to do with the failing system. They have everything to do with the failing system, because the system is premised on the absurd notion, first of all, that race is determinative, but secondarily, that public policy is determinative. Public policy does not get me out of bed in the morning. Public policy does not complete my child's assignments. Public policy doesn't teach a class. Public policy is words on paper. That's it. What education comes down to, what everything comes down to, economics, crime, law enforcement, comes down to people and their values. What do people value? What do people want? What are people trying to achieve? What are they pursuing and seeking to obtain and keep? That's the definition of a value. And if they're not valuing education, either for themselves or for their students, their children, if they're not making decisions in their lives that produce an environment that is supportive of and promotes educational achievement, then you cannot rationally expect that educational achievement will occur. It is not something, if a kid is in a crime ridden neighborhood with a single mother who has to scrape on two, three jobs getting by and isn't available to tutor him and there's nobody else in his life who's there instilling the value of education in his mind and in his heart and his soul, no law that Jeremy Munson introduces is going to change that. It's not.
You're
And so
right.
these root causes need to be addressed.
Yeah, you nailed it. I mean, I think that the root cause of this achievement gap is parental involvement. Is you know that I mean that, and it might be part of the socioeconomic status. It might be dual income versus one income families, but it's part of it, and you can address that without targeting racist policies, without targeting race. And one of the easiest ways to narrow the achievement gap that I think is very effective is to stop all of the enrichment programs, the what do we call them, the honor system, the honors classes that they have, that teach to the top, right?
Right.
The class
Right.
that I grew up going to, in this, in these programs, because that only widens the achievement gap. And that is what has occurred. They have stopped these advanced classes for kids to narrow the achievement gap, which is stupid, because then you're not teaching kids, you're just teaching to the bottom. And then you have kids who get in trouble because they're not challenged at school, because these advanced kids are not learning. That is the wrong policy, but that is what's being implemented alongside this racist legislation, that I have such a hard problem with. I don't even, I mean, it makes me mad as a parent, and I feel like I just am screaming it, and it's just not having an effect in our state, because our state's been, it's run by Democrats who are so beholden to the teachers union, who are just running this critical race theory program right into our state schools.
Well, it's, look, my dad had the solution to this problem. He moved out of Detroit. He moved to Minnesota from Michigan. He went to night school. He sought and obtained promotions, and he instilled values in his children that enabled us to pursue and keep values of our own. That's the solution. Let's see what law enabled that, other than, say, the 14th Amendment guaranteeing equal treatment under the law. See, that's government's role in this. Government's role in this is to ensure that our right to pursue happiness is protected and that it is not interfered with, as you state. The idea that we're going to take AP classes, we're going to take advanced placement classes, and we're going to get rid of them in order to create what? In order to create the statistical illusion of reducing the achievement gap by preventing the possibility of higher achievement. Now, we haven't actually improved anyone's lives. In fact, we've taken very specific steps to very intentionally degrade the value of people's lives in order to create the statistical illusion. That is, like, first of all, I don't believe that anybody who does that or supports that or has voted for that doesn't understand what they're doing. They're just evil. It's just an evil policy, and it's an intentionally, willfully evil policy. But beyond that, you cannot tell me that your objective is to improve lives if your methodology is destroying them.
The programs that passed in the Minnesota legislature that fund these racist policies include, like, millions and millions of dollars. There are that passed in the omnibus bill, like, $11 million for programs to increase the number of Black teachers, whether it's hiring people from other state. There's a program in Minneapolis that they want to set a goal of 20% of Black male teachers in the metro schools. So they've got tons of money for that. There's also this choose your own adventure type hiring program where you can design your own program that meets these certain qualifications. And I think there's $11 million for that one. I mean, there's lots of money out there to design their own programs in order to increase people of color in schools, which I think it's great that they want to have a diverse workforce. I think all companies are doing that, but it's if your ultimate goal is to do that to decrease the racial achievement gap, I think you're just fueling segregation, and that's wrong.
Well, and
Uh,
look, I would say that so the whole notion of we're going to pursue diversity for its own sake, I'll push back on that. Why? Why is a diverse faculty a better faculty? Why is a diverse student body a better student body? Why is a diverse anything better? You have to be able to answer that question.
Well, I'll answer
Um,
it for you. I mean, look,
sure.
I mean, I worked in corporate America for many years. I worked for some pretty, like, I worked for Norwest Bank, which bought Wells Fargo, and we brought in their diversity program, which was to hire people, specifically people of color, specifically Black people in Minneapolis, was our goal. And the reason why was because they said Black people come. This is terribly racist as I'm even saying this, but they're like, Black people are less educated and they bring more street smarts and different ways of solving problems to our company that are going to be really important. I mean, it was like, I remember sitting in the meeting going, if I was a Black person, I'd feel terrible if that was the reason why they were trying to increase diversity. But it
Mhm.
was, we need diverse methods of problem solving. And so we need to, take book smart people and street smart people and come up. And then that was the diversity of thought and culture. Um, Look, I remember. I mean, I put on when I don't know if I covered this already in this show, but when I applied for my job, or when I was filling out something after I was already employee, for some reason I was mad that day, and I just wanted to say I was Asian on on something, and it got changed in my employee file. And when the companies merged, and my job was already somebody already had my job in the San Francisco office, and they laid me off because I had checked the box saying I was Asian. They had this like huge problem with how they would get rid of me, and it took a lot longer and cost them a lot much more money than it should have. And because I was talking to somebody about Russian heritage, and I'm like, well, do you think Russians put Asian on? Do they check that box since it's part of Asia? And I just checked the box as a kind of a joke, but yeah, lo and behold, it triggered a big issue. So. Companies have diversity programs, and it is really about bringing together a diverse thought. And you know, I'll make
I
an
don't
argument for it.
I don't know that that's the purpose. I know that's what people say that they're trying to achieve is diversity of thought and diversity of perspective and diversity of experience. But no, again, none of that. If that's really what you're looking for, then you're not going to be looking at skin color to determine whether or not you're getting that. All right. If I'm looking for somebody who's technically savvy and potentially has some sort of genius level of innovation in the tech world, I'm not going to say, well, I'm only going to hire guys with brown hair, glasses, and light skin because look at Elon Musk and who's the Microsoft guy? Um,
Gates.
yeah, Bill Gates. Bill Gates and Elon Musk both have brown hair and white skin and glasses. Therefore, that's the only type of guy I'm going to look at because obviously those people are really smart, right? Like we recognize the absurdity of that idea. It is equally absurd to say that I want somebody street smart. Get me a black guy because he's the only possible guy who could have that particular skill set. How do I know? Because of the color of his skin. If that's how you know, then you're just being racist. Okay? You're not actually vetting for a particular skill set, which is determined through a person's accomplishments, their resume, their portfolio, what they're bringing to the table, what they've produced, the value that they're actually bringing. You're not looking at that. You're looking at the color of their skin, a box that they checked, as your story indicates, on a piece of paper. And that's how you're determining whether or not you've achieved your goal. I know they say they're looking for diversity of thought and perspective and experience. It's BS. They are being racists fulfilling quotas for the sake of racism.
Well, for the sake of changing the image of their company, when I challenged this policy at Wells Fargo, I remember sitting in a meeting and asking, why are we specifically why are we, why do we want to hire more people of color for this role when we have these applicants that are really good? And it was like, well, a lot of people that come into the company they come in because they're friends of people who work here. They used to value referrals because it means that they're trusted. You're not going to bring in somebody that you don't trust. And that was a way of building the company. And over time, they just had a whole bunch of white people bringing in their white friends and challenging the idea that, a white person could possibly be friends with a black person. And so we won't get diversity that way. But I thought it was interesting that, now the trend is to have, outside companies. They're getting rid of their HR departments and bringing in outside companies so that they're the ones making the decisions. They're the ones that are, blindly looking for keywords on people's resumes and doing, matches. And, we end up with people that are completely not loyal to companies. And the culture has changed that way. Now people have no loyalty to the company. They just move on. And I don't know. That's a whole different topic for a different show.